Blood trickled down Emma's swollen face as the scarred stranger lifted her broken body from the creek bed, his calloused hands gentler than any she'd ever known. "No man will ever touch you again," the silent cowboy vowed, his dark eyes burning with a promise that would cost them both everything they had left to give. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Emma Caldwell had never known pain like this. Her body screamed with every movement as she dragged herself along the creek bed, the cold water numbing her legs, but doing little to ease the burning agony of her broken ribs. 3 days on the run from Silas Whitney had left her half dead, her once fine dress torn and bloodied, her face a mottled canvas of purple and yellow bruises. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. The berries she'd managed to forage yesterday had barely sustained her, and now even the strength to gather those was fading. The sound of approaching hooves sent terror shooting through her. Had he found her? Had Silas tracked her all the way out here, to this desolate stretch of wilderness miles from the nearest settlement? Emma tried to crawl beneath the shelter of a fallen tree, her fingers digging into the mud as she fought to make herself invisible. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. A man's voice, deep and rough, called out, "Who's there?" Emma held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the mud. Perhaps if she stayed perfectly still, he would ride on. She couldn't risk being found, not when she'd come this far. The sound of boots hitting the ground, then cautious footsteps approaching. Emma closed her eyes, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. "Ma'am, you hurt?" The voice was closer now, just above her hiding place. A shadow fell across her face, and Emma looked up into the eyes of a stranger. He was tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that had seen more than its share of hardship. A jagged scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone, giving him a fearsome appearance. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark as coffee grounds, steady and watchful, revealing nothing of the thoughts behind them. He crouched beside her, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Can you speak?" Emma tried to answer, but her parched throat produced only a raspy whisper. "Please, don't..." "Don't what, ma'am?" The man reached for his canteen, uncorking it with practiced efficiency. "Here, drink." The water was cool and clean, and Emma drank greedily until he gently pulled it away. "Slow now. Too much at once will make you sick." His careful consideration startled her. Silas had never shown such restraint, such concern. She studied the stranger more carefully. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, a cotton shirt beneath a leather vest, denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. A black Stetson shadowed his face, and a gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster holding what appeared to be a well-maintained Colt. "Name's Elijah Tanner," he said, offering nothing more. His gaze swept over her injuries with clinical detachment, cataloging each bruise, each cut. "Who did this to you?" Emma turned away. "No one. I fell." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Ma'am, I've seen falls. I've seen accidents. This ain't either of those things." "Please," Emma whispered. "I need to keep moving. He'll find me." Understanding dawned in Elijah's eyes. "Husband?" Emma nodded, the simple gesture sending pain lancing through her neck. "Former fiancé. I ran before the wedding." Elijah's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. "You got somewhere to go?" "My aunt's place in Silver Pine. It's about 50 miles north." Emma tried to push herself up, but collapsed with a cry of pain. "You've got at least 2 broken ribs," Elijah observed. "Probably more. You'll never make Silver Pine in this condition." "I have to try." Desperation edged her voice. "You don't understand. Silas is the type of man who gets what he wants, always, and he wants me back." Elijah stood, surveying the creek and the surrounding terrain. His ranch was a day's ride south, his cattle secure for now with his foreman watching over things. He'd only come this way tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on his calves. Now, it seemed, fate had put something else in his path. "My place is a day's ride from here," he said finally. "You can rest there. Heal up. Then I'll take you to Silver Pine myself." Emma stared at him, disbelief warring with desperate hope. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Elijah's hand unconsciously rose to the scar on his face, tracing its jagged path. "I know what it's like to be hunted." He reached down, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he lifted her. Emma gasped at the pain, but Elijah cradled her against his chest, careful of her injuries as he carried her to his horse. "I don't even know your name," he said as he settled her in the saddle. Emma Caldwell." Elijah nodded once, then swung up behind her, one arm securely around her waist to keep her steady. "Miss Caldwell, I'm taking you somewhere safe. I give you my word." As they rode away from the creek, Emma felt the warmth of his body behind her, solid and reassuring. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe she might survive. The Tanner Ranch appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to set, a modest spread with a sturdy log cabin, a barn, and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden prairie grass. It wasn't grand, nothing like the Whitney estate she'd fled, but it radiated something Silas's sprawling mansion never had: peace. Emma had drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, lulled by the rhythmic motion of the horse and the steady presence of the man behind her. Each time she woke, she found his arm still securely around her, his eyes scanning the horizon for danger. "We're here," Elijah said, his breath warm against her ear. "Can you hold on while I dismount?" Emma nodded weakly, gripping the saddle horn as he swung down. The pain in her ribs had settled into a constant throbbing ache that made each breath a careful negotiation. Elijah lifted her from the horse with the same gentle efficiency he'd shown at the creek, carrying her toward the cabin. An older man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Elijah, that ain't no mountain lion you're carrying." "Joseph, prepare the spare room," Elijah called, "and fetch those medical supplies Doc Parsons left last winter." Joseph took one look at Emma's battered face and nodded grimly. "Yes, sir." He hurried ahead to open the cabin door. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs occupied another. The floors were polished pine, covered here and there with woven rugs. It smelled of coffee and wood smoke and something else, leather perhaps, or the faint tang of tobacco. Elijah carried Emma to a small bedroom off the main living area. The bed was neatly made with a patchwork quilt, and Joseph was already lighting a lamp on the bedside table. "Who is she?" Joseph asked as he helped Elijah settle Emma on the bed. "Name's Emma Caldwell. Found her by Cottonwood Creek, beat half to death." Elijah's voice was flat, but Emma caught the undercurrent of anger. Her fiancé's work. Joseph's weathered face darkened. "Bastard. He'll be looking for her," Elijah said. "I need you to ride to town tomorrow. Tell Sheriff Barnes we might have trouble coming." "Yes, sir." Joseph handed Elijah a wooden box of medical supplies, then retreated, closing the door behind him. Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, opening the box. "I need to check your ribs, Miss Caldwell, and clean those cuts." Emma nodded, too exhausted to protest. As Elijah's careful hands began tending her wounds, she studied his face. The scar looked even more pronounced in the lamplight, a jagged reminder of violence survived. "How did you get it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The scar." Elijah's hands paused momentarily. Man who didn't like being told no. He resumed, cleaning a cut on her forehead. Same kind of man who did this to you, I expect. Did you kill him? The question surprised even Emma herself. Elijah's eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. No, but I made sure he'd never touch another woman again. Something in his tone made Emma believe him absolutely. As his gentle hands continued their work, she felt tears gather in her eyes, not from pain, but from the strange kindness of this scarred, silent man who'd found her by the creek. No man will ever touch you again, Elijah said softly, his words a solemn vow. Not while I draw breath. As darkness fell outside, Emma closed her eyes, surrendering to exhaustion. For the first time since she'd fled Silas's rage, she allowed herself to truly rest, protected by the silent cowboy and his promise. Emma woke to sunlight streaming through a window she didn't recognize, panic surging through her until the events of the previous day came flooding back. The creek, the silent cowboy, the promise of safety. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her ribs forced her back against the pillows with a gasp. Easy now. Elijah's deep voice came from the doorway. He stood there holding a tray, his massive frame nearly filling the space. Those ribs need at least a week before you start moving around much. Emma watched as he approached, setting the tray on the bedside table. A bowl of something steaming, a cup of coffee, and a small plate with bread and butter. The simple kindness of the gesture made her throat tighten. Thank you, she managed, the words feeling inadequate. Elijah nodded once, pulling a chair beside the bed. His movements were efficient, economical, as if he'd learned long ago not to waste energy on unnecessary gestures. Can you feed yourself, or do you need help? I can manage. Emma reached for the spoon, her hand trembling slightly. The simple act of bringing soup to her mouth was exhausting, but she refused to show weakness. Not again. Not after what it had cost her with Silas. Elijah watched her struggle for a moment before speaking. Pride's a luxury you can't afford right now, Miss Caldwell. Not if you want those ribs to heal proper. Emma looked up, surprised by his directness. His dark eyes held no judgment, only a practical assessment of her condition. She slowly lowered the spoon. Perhaps a little help would be welcome. He took the bowl without comment, his large hands dwarfing it as he carefully spooned broth to her lips. The soup was simple, chicken, vegetables, and herbs, but to Emma, who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, it tasted like heaven. Joseph rode to town this morning, Elijah said, as he continued feeding her. Sheriff Barnes will keep an eye out for your fiancé. Former fiancé, Emma corrected, her voice stronger now that food was reviving her. And Sheriff Barnes won't be much help if Silas decides to come looking. The Whitneys practically own the law in 3 counties. Elijah's expression didn't change, but Emma noticed his jaw tighten slightly. Money talks loud, that's a fact, but this is my land. Different rules apply here. They fell into silence as Emma finished the soup. When she'd eaten all she could, Elijah set the bowl aside and helped her drink the coffee. It was strong and sweetened with honey, nothing like the delicate china cups of weak tea Silas had insisted were appropriate for ladies. The Whitney family, Elijah said after a while. Big cattle operation out of Riverbend? Emma nodded, surprised. You know them? Know of them. Their reputation rides ahead. Elijah's tone was neutral, but his eyes had darkened. Old man Whitney's son took over a few years back, been buying up land, water rights, forcing out smaller ranchers. Silas, Emma confirmed. His father died 3 years ago, left everything to his only son. She hesitated, then added, that's when he changed. Or perhaps that's when I finally saw who he truly was. Elijah waited, saying nothing, his silence an invitation to continue if she wished. We grew up together, Emma said softly. Our families were neighbors, friends. When he proposed last year, everyone said what a perfect match it was, but after his father died and he took control of the Whitney holdings, something shifted in him, like having that power revealed something that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. Power doesn't change men, Elijah said, just makes them more of what they already are. The truth of his words struck Emma deeply. Yes, exactly that. She looked down at her bruised hands. The first time he hit me was after I questioned a business decision. He apologized immediately, bought me a diamond bracelet. I told myself it was the strain of his new responsibilities. Elijah's expression remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped his knee. The second time was when I spoke to another man at a social gathering. No jewelry that time, just control. Where I could go, who I could speak to, what I could wear. Emma's voice grew distant. By the third time, I knew I had to leave. I waited until he went to Denver on business, then took what little money I had and ran. How'd he find you? My friend's farm where I was hiding. He burned it to the ground. Emma closed her eyes against the memory. I got away, but Martha and her husband, they weren't so fortunate. Elijah stood abruptly, moving to the window. His broad shoulders were tense, his breathing carefully controlled. He killed them. The fire was ruled an accident, Emma said bitterly. But yes, he killed them because they helped me. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of her confession. Emma watched Elijah's back, wondering if she'd made a mistake in revealing the extent of Silas's depravity. Perhaps he would reconsider helping her now, understanding the danger. Joseph said you were a soldier, she said, changing the subject. Before you became a rancher. Elijah turned, his expression guarded. Not exactly. Cavalry scout during the war, then a bounty hunter for a spell. Is that how you got the scar? His hand unconsciously rose to his face. Hunting a man who'd murdered his wife, caught up to him in a saloon in Deadwood. He didn't take kindly to being interrupted while he was drinking. You brought him in anyway. What was left of him? Elijah's voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of bravado. Last job I took. Bought this place the next day. Been here ever since. Emma studied him, this quiet man whose violence seemed so controlled, so purposeful. Nothing like Silas's explosive rage. How long ago was that? 5 years this October. You've been alone all that time? Something flickered in his eyes, a brief shadow of emotion quickly suppressed. Joseph's been with me since the beginning. Couple of ranch hands come and go with the seasons. It's enough. Emma sensed there was more to the story, but Elijah's posture had closed off further questions. Instead, she asked, "Will you tell me about your ranch? I'd like to know where I am." His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he returned to the chair beside her bed. For the next hour, he described his modest cattle operation, the challenges of ranching in this territory, the rhythm of seasons that governed his life. His voice, usually so spare with words, grew almost lyrical when speaking of the land he loved. Emma found herself entranced, not just by what he said, but by the glimpses of the man beneath the stoic exterior. This was no crude frontiersman, but an educated mind who chose solitude, who found peace in the harsh beauty of the wilderness. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Elijah rose instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Don't make a sound." As he left the bedroom, pulling the door closed behind him, Emma felt fear creeping back. Had Silas found her already? Was this small haven of safety about to be shattered like all the others? Through the thin walls, she heard men's voices. Elijah's deep rumble, then another she didn't recognize. Their words were indistinct, but the tension in their tone was unmistakable. Then silence, followed by the sound of the front door closing. When Elijah returned, his expression was grim. "What is it?" Emma asked, her heart pounding. "Is it Silas?" "Not yet," Elijah said, his voice tight. but he's offering $500 for information about your whereabouts, dead or alive. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. How do you know? Sheriff Barnes sent word. Bounty notices went up in Riverbend yesterday. Elijah's dark eyes met hers. Your former fiancé claims you stole family heirlooms before running, says you're unstable, dangerous. That's not true, Emma whispered. I took nothing but the clothes on my back. I know. Elijah's response was immediate, without hesitation. But it means every bounty hunter and desperate man for 100 miles will be looking for you now. Emma closed her eyes, despair washing over her. I should leave. I've put you in danger just by being here. No. The single word was spoken with such quiet authority that her eyes snapped open. Elijah stood by her bed, his face set in lines of determination. My vow stands. No man will touch you. Not Whitney. Not any bounty hunter. Not while I draw breath. As the afternoon light cast long shadows across the bedroom floor, Emma looked up at the scarred cowboy who had become her unexpected protector, and for the first time in months, allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. Days passed with a gentle rhythm at the Tanner Ranch. Emma's strength returned gradually, her body healing under Elijah's watchful care. By the end of the first week, she could sit on the porch for short periods, wrapped in a quilt against the autumn chill, watching Elijah and Joseph work with the cattle in the distance. There was something mesmerizing about Elijah's connection with the animals. Even from afar, she could see how they responded to him, how his quiet authority extended to beast as well as man. Unlike Silas, who shouted and bullied his ranch hands and livestock alike, Elijah moved with a calm assurance that required no violence to command respect. He's got the touch, Joseph said one afternoon, pausing on his way to the barn. The older man had been initially reserved with Emma, but had gradually warmed to her presence. Been around horses and cattle my whole life. Never seen anything like it. Has he always been so... Emma searched for the right word. Silent. Joseph chuckled. He wasn't always. War changed him. Then that business with the Hargrove woman finished what the war started. Emma's curiosity piqued. Hargrove woman. Joseph's weathered face closed off immediately. Not my place to say. If Elijah wants you knowing about Isabel Hargrove, he'll tell you himself. He tipped his hat and continued to the barn, leaving Emma with more questions than answers. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, watching Elijah in the distance as he expertly cut a calf from the herd. Who was Isabel Hargrove? And what had happened to make Joseph so reluctant to speak of her? That evening, as they sat before the fireplace after supper, Emma found herself studying Elijah's profile in the flickering light. The scar seemed less harsh in the golden glow, though no less a testament to violence survived. He was reading, his large hands holding a worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, with unexpected gentleness. You're staring, Miss Caldwell, he said without looking up from his page. Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. I apologize. I was just wondering about everything. She gestured vaguely at him, at the room, at the peaceful life he'd carved out of this wild country. How you came to be here, why you choose to live so far from town, why you took me in. Elijah closed his book, his dark eyes finally meeting hers. That's a lot of wondering. Joseph mentioned someone today, Isabel Hargrove. The change was immediate and dramatic. Elijah's body tensed, his expression shuddering closed like windows before a storm. He stood abruptly, moving to stare into the fire. Joseph talks too much. He didn't actually tell me anything, Emma said softly. Just her name. For a long moment, Elijah said nothing, his broad back to her, shoulders rigid with some emotion she couldn't name. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, self-controlled. Isabel Hargrove was my wife. Emma felt the shock of his words like a physical blow. She had assumed he was unmarried, had never considered the possibility that this solitary man had once shared his life with someone. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. "She died." Elijah turned back to face her, his expression remote, unreadable. 4 years ago. Emma wanted to ask more, but the pain radiating from him was palpable. "I'm sorry," she said instead. "I shouldn't have pried." Elijah nodded once, accepting her apology. Then, to her surprise, he returned to his chair and picked up his book again, but he didn't open it, merely held it in his hands, staring at the worn cover. "She was a school teacher from Boston," he said finally. "Came out west to teach at the territorial school. We met when I brought in a man who'd robbed the school fund." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She wasn't impressed with my profession." "Bounty hunting," Emma supplied. "Said it was just killing for money." Elijah's fingers traced the edge of his book. "She wasn't entirely wrong, but she married you anyway." "Took 2 years of courting. I built this place for her, thinking a home might convince her where words failed." His voice softened with memory. "She loved books, filled the house with them, said every ranch needed a library, no matter how small." Emma glanced at the shelves lining one wall, understanding now why a cattle rancher would have volumes of poetry and philosophy among the practical manuals on animal husbandry. "She sounds remarkable," Emma said. "She was." Elijah's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, his guard lowered enough for her to see the depth of loss he still carried. "She was shot by a man I'd brought in years before. He broke out of prison, tracked me here, found her alone while I was in town." The horror of it struck Emma speechless. No wonder Elijah lived so contained, so controlled. He'd lost everything because of his past, because of violence that had followed him home. "That's why you stopped bounty hunting," she said when she found her voice. "Too late to matter." His tone was flat, final. He opened his book again, clearly signaling the end of the conversation. Emma sat in silence, absorbing what she'd learned. Elijah had known exactly what kind of danger he was inviting when he took her in, when he promised to protect her from Silas. He'd already paid the ultimate price once for violence that followed him home, yet he'd done it anyway. The realization humbled her. Sleep eluded Emma that night. She lay in bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny from the horses in the barn, the soft hooting of an owl somewhere nearby. This peaceful world Elijah had built, tainted once by tragedy, was now threatened again because of her. A sound outside her window startled her fully awake. Footsteps, stealthy and careful, circling the house. Emma froze, her heart pounding. Had Silas found her already? Had one of the bounty hunters tracked her to the Tanner ranch? She slipped from bed, ignoring the protest of her healing ribs, and moved silently to the window. In the moonlight, she could make out a figure creeping toward the barn, rifle in hand. Not Silas. This man was shorter, slighter. A bounty hunter, then. Emma reached for the dress draped over a chair, pulling it on quickly. She had to warn Elijah. As she turned toward the door, it opened silently. Elijah stood there, fully dressed, gun belt strapped to his waist. "Stay here," he whispered. "Lock the door behind me." "There's someone outside," she breathed. "By the barn." "I know. Joseph heard him first." Elijah's eyes were hard in the darkness. "Stay inside no matter what happens." Before she could protest, he was gone, slipping through the house like a shadow. Emma locked the door as instructed, then returned to the window, straining to see what was happening outside. The minutes stretched endlessly. Then a shout broke the silence, followed by the crack of a rifle shot. Emma flinched, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. More shouting, then another shot. The sound of running footsteps, a horse galloping away into the night. When Elijah finally returned, there was blood on his shirt. "Are you hurt?" Emma gasped, reaching for him instinctively. "Not mine." His voice was grim. "Bounty hunter. Got away, but Joseph winged him. He won't get far with that shoulder." "He'll bring others," Emma said, the realization sinking like a stone in her stomach. Elijah nodded, his expression grave. "First light. We ride from my line cabin in the North Range. It's remote, defensible. We'll stay there until we figure out our next move." "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door," Emma whispered, guilt washing over her. Elijah's calloused hand gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. In the dim light, his scarred face was a study in determination. "This trouble was coming with or without you, Emma. Men like your fiancé, like the bounty hunters, they don't stop, they don't change. All we can do is stand against them." His voice softened slightly. "Get some rest. Dawn comes early." As he turned to leave, Emma caught his hand. "Elijah, thank you." He looked down at their joined hands, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, before he carefully withdrew his fingers from hers. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "We've still got a long way to go." They left before dawn, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten as Elijah helped Emma onto a sturdy dun mare. Despite her protests that she could ride on her own, he'd insisted on packing only 2 horses, her mare and his black stallion. Joseph would remain behind to maintain appearances at the ranch and throw off any more bounty hunters who came looking. "The North Range is rough country," Elijah explained as he checked the cinch on Emma's saddle. 30 miles of the hardest terrain in the territory, no place for someone still healing. Emma wanted to argue, but the truth was that even the simple act of sitting upright in the saddle sent pain shooting through her ribs. The thought of a full day's ride made her lightheaded with dread. "How long will it take?" she asked, adjusting her borrowed coat against the pre-dawn chill. 2 days at the pace we'll need to keep." Elijah swung effortlessly onto his own mount. "We'll stop at Broken Ridge tonight, push through to the cabin tomorrow." Joseph appeared from the barn, leading a pack horse laden with supplies. The older man's face was grim as he handed the lead rope to Elijah. "Sheriff Barnes sent word," he said quietly. "Whitney himself crossed into the territory yesterday. Got 6 men with him." Elijah's expression didn't change, but Emma saw his hand tighten on the reins. "He's moving faster than I expected. You know what to do if he shows up here." Joseph nodded. "I ain't seen either of you in 3 days. You rode south toward the border." "And if he doesn't believe you?" The older man patted the shotgun slung over his shoulder. "Then I'll give him something else to think about." "No heroics," Elijah warned. "If it comes to that, you get on that Appaloosa and ride for town. I won't have more blood on my conscience." Joseph's weathered face softened briefly. "Been making my own choices for 63 years, son. Don't you go taking responsibility for them now." Emma watched the exchange with a growing sense of guilt. These men were risking everything for her, their safety, their home, perhaps even their lives. And Joseph's parting words to Elijah suggested that he knew exactly what they were facing, having perhaps witnessed the aftermath of Isabel's death years before. "Mr. Joseph," she said impulsively, "I don't know how to thank you." The old cowhand tipped his hat to her. "Just come back in one piece, Miss Emma. Been too long since this place had a woman's touch." His eyes flicked to Elijah, then back to her. Been too long since he had something to protect that wasn't just land and cattle. Before Emma could respond to this surprising statement, Elijah clicked to his horse and moved out, leaving her to follow. She cast one last glance at Joseph, standing tall and resolute in the yard, then urged her mare after Elijah's retreating form. They rode in silence as the sun climbed above the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Emma found herself stealing glances at Elijah's broad back. wondering at the complexity of this man who had become her protector. Last night's revelation about Isabel explained so much. His solitude, his reluctance to engage with the world, his instinctive understanding of the danger Silas posed. Yet he had taken her in anyway, knowing full well what it might cost him. The terrain gradually changed as they rode north, the flat grasslands giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine and scrub oak. By midday, they were following a narrow trail that wound through increasingly rugged country, the distant mountains looming larger with each passing hour. "We need to stop," Elijah said finally, reining in beside a small creek sheltered by cottonwoods. "Rest the horses. Check your ribs." Emma was grateful for the reprieve, though she would never have admitted how much the journey was taxing her strength. Elijah helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady around her waist. For a brief moment, she leaned against him, allowing herself to draw comfort from his solid presence before stepping away. He busied himself with the horses while Emma sank onto a fallen log, watching him work. There was an economy to his movements, a sense of purpose that made even the most mundane tasks seem deliberate and important. "You miss it, don't you?" she asked suddenly. Elijah glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Miss what?" "Bounty hunting. The life you had before." His hands stilled on the saddle strap he was adjusting. "No," he said after a moment. "Not the hunting, not the killing." He resumed his work, but his voice continued lower now. "But the purpose, maybe. Knowing each day exactly what needed doing and why." "And ranching doesn't give you that?" "It's different." Elijah led the horses to water, giving them each a gentle pat as they drank. Hunting men is simple, good and evil, black and white. Ranching is all shades of gray, drought years and wet years, markets rising and falling, nature giving and taking away. No real victories, just survival. Emma considered his words. "Is that why you took me in? Because I represented something clear? A wrong that needed righting?" Elijah turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. "I took you in because you needed help. Nothing more complicated than that." But Emma wasn't convinced. There was something in his manner, some unspoken motivation that went beyond simple charity. Before she could press further, however, he stiffened, his gaze shifting to the hills behind them. "Someone's following us," he said quietly, his hand moving to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "Get behind those trees now." Emma didn't question him, moving quickly despite her pain to the shelter of the cottonwoods. Elijah positioned himself between her and the open country, rifle at the ready as he scanned the horizon. Long minutes passed in tense silence. Then Emma saw it. Movement on a distant ridge, the sun glinting briefly off something metal. A rifle scope, perhaps, or field glasses. "Bounty hunter?" she whispered. "No." Elijah's voice was tight. "Bounty hunters travel alone or in pairs. That's a larger group." "Silas." The name escaped her lips like a prayer in reverse, a summoning of fear rather than faith. "Mount up," Elijah ordered, not taking his eyes off the distant riders. "We need to reach Broken Ridge before they cut us off." The rest of the day passed in a blur of hard riding and anxious glances over their shoulders. Elijah set a punishing pace, pushing their mounts as hard as he dared over the increasingly rough terrain. Emma clung to her saddle, gritting her teeth against the pain in her ribs, determined not to slow them down. By late afternoon, they had entered true mountain country. Pine forests interspersed with meadows, steep ravines cutting through rocky slopes. Elijah led them on game trails barely visible to Emma's untrained eye, doubling back occasionally to confuse their trail. As dusk approached, they crested a rise and Emma saw their destination, a small, crude shelter nestled against a cliff face almost invisible among the surrounding pines. "Broken Ridge," Elijah announced, helping her dismount. Her legs nearly buckled as they touched the ground. muscles protesting the long hours in the saddle. "It's not much, but it'll keep us safe for the night." The shelter was indeed basic, little more than 3 walls, a roof, and a stone fireplace. But it offered protection from the wind and would conceal the small fire Elijah quickly built. As darkness fell, he prepared a simple meal of beans, jerky, and coffee, their movements illuminated by the firelight. "Will they find us here?" Emma asked, accepting the tin cup he offered. "Not likely. We crossed 3 creeks and rode over mostly rock the last few miles." Elijah settled beside her, his rifle within easy reach. "Even if they picked up our trail again, they won't risk these mountains after dark." Emma sipped her coffee, grateful for its warmth. "How far to your cabin from here?" "Another day's ride. Harder country than what we've seen so far, but safer once we're there." He studied her face in the firelight. "How are your ribs holding up?" "I'll manage," she said, unwilling to admit how much pain she was in. Elijah's gaze was knowing. "Let me check them." Too exhausted to argue, Emma allowed him to examine her injuries, his touch professional and impersonal, as he felt along her rib cage. Yet despite his clinical approach, she found herself acutely aware of him. The rough warmth of his hands, the clean scent of pine and leather that clung to him, the careful gentleness that belied his imposing presence. "Healing well," he pronounced finally. "But tomorrow's ride won't help matters. Try to sleep. I'll take first watch." As Emma settled into her bedroll, watching Elijah's silhouette against the night sky as he stood guard, she was struck by a realization. For the first time since fleeing Silas, she felt not just protected but seen. This scarred, silent man understood her in ways no one else had ever bothered to try. And as sleep claimed her, she wondered if perhaps she was beginning to understand him too. Dawn broke cold and clear over Broken Ridge, revealing a landscape transformed by overnight frost. Emma woke to find Elijah already up, tending the horses with quiet efficiency. Her body protested every movement as she rose, muscles stiff from yesterday's ride, ribs aching despite the careful way she'd slept. "Storm coming," Elijah said by way of greeting, nodding toward the western horizon where dark clouds gathered. "Need to reach the cabin before it hits." They ate a hasty breakfast of cold biscuits and jerky, then broke camp with practiced speed. Elijah had clearly done this many times before, his movements economical and precise. Emma did her best to help despite her limitations, determined not to be a burden. "You ride much before all this?" Elijah asked as he helped her mount. "My father raised horses," Emma replied, settling gingerly into the saddle. "I was riding before I could walk." Something like approval flickered in Elijah's eyes. "That explains your seat." Lanes. "Most society women I've known ride like sacks of grain tied to the saddle." Emma found herself smiling despite their circumstances. "My mother despaired of ever making a proper lady of me. Said I'd rather muck stalls than attend tea parties." "Smart woman." Elijah swung onto his own horse. "Your mother, I mean." The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as the day progressed, winding through pine forests and along narrow ridges that dropped away precipitously on either side. Elijah led them with unerring confidence, occasionally doubling back or taking seemingly arbitrary turns that Emma later realized were calculated to confuse any pursuit. By midday, the storm clouds had rolled closer, bringing with them a bitter wind that cut through Emma's borrowed coat. She hunched lower in the saddle, trying to conserve warmth as the temperature dropped. Elijah glanced back at her frequently, his brow furrowed with concern. "Not much farther," he called over his shoulder as they climbed a particularly steep section of trail. "Another hour, maybe less." Emma nodded, too cold and weary to respond verbally. Her world had narrowed to the rhythmic movement of her horse beneath her and the broad, reassuring shape of Elijah's back ahead. 1 mile after another, 1 hour bleeding into the next, as they climbed ever higher into the mountains. When they finally crested a rocky ridge, and Emma saw the cabin nestled in a small sheltered valley below, tears of relief sprang to her eyes. It was larger than she'd expected, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney, small windows covered with oiled paper, and a corral for the horses. A creek ran nearby, partially frozen but still flowing, and a woodpile stacked against the cabin wall promised warmth against the approaching storm. "It's beautiful," she breathed as they descended toward it. Elijah glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "It's just a line cabin for watching the north herd during calving season." "It's safety," Emma said simply. "After what I've been through, that makes it beautiful." They reached the cabin just as the first snowflakes began to fall. Elijah quickly settled the horses in the small attached lean-to, ensuring they had hay and water, while Emma waited on the cabin's narrow porch. When he finally unlocked the door and ushered her inside, she found herself in a simple but comfortable space, one large room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a small kitchen area, and a bed built into one corner. One bed. Emma's eyes lingered on it for a moment before quickly looking away. If Elijah noticed her discomfort, he gave no sign. He moved with practiced efficiency, starting a fire in the hearth, bringing in supplies from the pack horses, checking the cabin's perimeter. Within an hour, the space was transformed, warm, provisioned, secure against both weather and potential attackers. "I'll sleep by the fire," he said, addressing her unspoken concern as he hung a pot of water over the flames to heat. "You take the bed." Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I didn't mean to. That is, I wouldn't presume. I know." His voice was gentle without mockery. "But you're still healing, and the bed's better for your ribs." Outside, the storm had arrived in earnest, snow falling in thick curtains that obscured the view beyond the windows. Wind howled around the cabin's corners, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. But inside, the fire cast a warm glow over the rustic furnishings, creating an unexpected sense of peace. As evening approached, they shared a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and coffee. Emma found herself watching Elijah across the table, noting how the firelight softened his features, making the scar seem less a mark of violence and more a natural part of him, like the grain in wood or the patterns in stone. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her gaze. Emma considered deflecting, then decided on honesty. "That I know almost nothing about you, yet I've trusted you with my life." "Not much to know," he replied, but his tone invited her to continue. "Where did you grow up before the war, before bounty hunting? Who were you then?" Elijah's hand stilled around his coffee cup. For a moment, Emma thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Pennsylvania, small town outside Pittsburgh. My father was a blacksmith." A faint smile touched his lips. "Good man. Honest. Taught me his trade before the war took me." "You fought for the Union." "Cavalry scout, like I told you. Spent more time behind enemy lines than with my own regiment." His expression darkened slightly. "Learned things about myself during those years, things I'm not proud of. Such as, that killing comes easy to me." He met her eyes directly. "That I'm good at it. Too good, maybe." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Emma should have been frightened by his words, should have recoiled from this confession of violence. Instead, she found herself reaching across the table, her hand covering his. "Yet here you are, choosing not to kill, even when it would be easier." Her fingers tightened slightly. "That's the measure of a man, Elijah. Not what comes naturally, but what he chooses to do despite it." Something shifted in his eyes, a softening, a surprise at being understood rather than judged. Before he could respond, however, a sound from outside caught his attention. He stiffened, head turning toward the window. "What is it?" Emma whispered, instantly alert. "Not sure." Elijah moved silently to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. After a long moment, he relaxed slightly. "Probably just a branch breaking under the snow, but we should be careful. No fire after dark tomorrow." Emma nodded, but a chill that had nothing to do with the storm ran through her. They had covered their tracks well, had pushed hard to reach this remote sanctuary. But Silas was not a man to give up easily, especially when his pride was at stake. Later, as she lay in the bed with Elijah's coat added to her blankets for warmth, she watched his silhouette against the dying fire. He sat in a chair by the window, rifle across his lap, keeping watch despite the raging storm outside. "You should rest," she said softly. "The storm will keep anyone from finding us tonight." "Perhaps." But he didn't move from his post. "Why are you doing this, Elijah?" The question had been building in her for days. Why risk everything for a woman you barely know? He was silent so long that Emma thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the howling of the wind. "After Isabel died, I buried more than my wife. Buried part of myself, too." His profile remained still, face turned toward the window. "Thought it was safer that way. Easier. Just exist, don't live. Don't feel." Emma held her breath, afraid to break the spell of his rare openness. "Then I found you by that creek," he continued, broken, hunted, refusing to give up despite everything. He turned toward her, his face in shadow, but his voice carrying a warmth she hadn't heard before. "You reminded me that some things are still worth fighting for." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within Emma, a place that Silas's cruelty had never been able to reach. As sleep finally claimed her, she carried with her the image of Elijah's vigilant silhouette and the unexpected gift of his trust. Outside, unheard beneath the storm's fury, a horse whinnied softly from the ridge above the cabin. Morning brought an eerie stillness, the storm having spent its fury sometime in the night. Emma woke to find the cabin bathed in pale blue light, filtering through snow-crusted windows. The fire had died to embers, and the air held a biting chill. Elijah was gone from his post by the window. Panic fluttered in her chest until she heard movement outside, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and moved to the window, rubbing a clear spot in the frost to peer out. Elijah stood at the chopping block, his breath clouding in the frigid air as he split logs with powerful practice swings. The landscape around him was transformed, blanketed in white that sparkled in the early morning sun. It would have been breathtakingly beautiful if not for the tracks she noticed, horse tracks leading up the ridge, partially filled with fresh snow but still visible. The door opened, and Elijah entered with an armload of wood, stopping short when he saw her at the window. "You should be resting," he said, kicking the door closed behind him. "There are tracks," Emma said, ignoring his concern. "Someone was here during the storm." Elijah's expression remained carefully neutral as he stacked the wood beside the hearth. "Found them at first light. Single rider. Came down from the ridge, circled the cabin, then headed back the way he came. One of Silas's men? Most likely a scout. He knelt to rebuild the fire, his movements efficient despite what must have been a sleepless night. Good news is, he left. Bad news is, he knows we're here." Fear coiled in Emma's stomach. "How did they find us? You said the storm would cover our trail." "Storm came too late." Elijah placed kindling carefully, then blew gently until flames caught. "Or they got lucky. Either way, we need to be ready." Ready for what? But Emma already knew the answer. This remote cabin, which yesterday had seemed like sanctuary, had become a trap. "We should leave. Find somewhere else to hide." Elijah straightened, his dark eyes meeting hers. "No place to go that's safer than here. Town's 3 days' ride in good weather. Territory lines even further, and you're in no condition for hard travel. But if we stay..." "If we stay," he interrupted gently, "we fight on ground I know, with preparations I've already made." For the first time, Emma noticed details about the cabin she'd missed in her exhaustion the night before. The windows were positioned to allow clear views in all directions. The walls, seemingly simple log construction, were actually reinforced with inner layers of timber. The water barrel by the door meant they wouldn't need to venture to the creek if under siege. "You built this place to be defended," she realized. Elijah nodded, moving to prepare coffee. "After Isabel, I built everything with defense in mind." The admission hung between them, a reminder of all he had lost, all that had shaped him into the careful, prepared man before her. "How long do we have?" Emma asked, forcing herself to think practically. "Scout will take most of the day to reach Whitney and bring him back. Snow will slow them." Elijah measured coffee grounds with precision. "Tomorrow morning, most likely." "And then?" His gaze was steady, unflinching. "And then we see what kind of man your fiancé truly is." The day passed in tense preparation. Despite her protests, Elijah insisted Emma rest as much as possible, allowing her only the lightest tasks while he methodically readied the cabin for what was coming. He cleaned his rifle and pistol, positioned extra ammunition at strategic points, and prepared supplies that could be quickly gathered if they needed to flee. By afternoon, Emma could bear the enforced inactivity no longer. "Let me help," she insisted, joining him as he inventoried their food supplies. "I'm not some delicate flower that will wilt at the first sign of trouble." Elijah paused, studying her with those penetrating eyes. "Never thought you were," he said finally. "But Silas Whitney is coming for you because of what you represent to him, property that ran away. A challenge to his authority, his pride." "I know exactly what I am to Silas," Emma said bitterly. "Then you know he'll do anything to get you back." Elijah's voice was gentle but unflinching. "What happens tomorrow will be ugly, Emma. There's no avoiding that. I'm no stranger to ugliness." Emma held his gaze. "Silas showed me plenty of that during our engagement." Something shifted in Elijah's expression, a softening, an acknowledgement of her strength. "All right," he said. "Check the medical supplies, corner cupboard. Make sure everything's accessible if needed." As she sorted through bandages and tinctures, Emma fought against the memories threatening to overwhelm her. Silas's rages, the casual cruelty that had escalated with each passing month, the moment she'd finally decided to flee. She had been half dead when Elijah found her by the creek, not just from her physical injuries, but from the systematic destruction of her spirit that Silas had nearly completed. Yet here she was, preparing for a fight rather than cowering in fear. Something had changed within her during these days with Elijah. Some vital spark rekindled by his quiet strength, his unwavering respect, his belief in her worth as more than someone's possession. Evening brought another simple meal and another night of snow, lighter than before but enough to further blanket the landscape. They sat before the fire afterward, the silence between them comfortable despite the tension of their circumstances. "Tell me about your father's horses," Elijah said suddenly. Emma looked up, surprised. "What?" "You said your father raised horses. Tell me about them." His eyes were warm in the firelight. "I'd like to hear something good tonight." Understanding dawned. He was offering distraction, a moment of peace before tomorrow's reckoning. Emma found herself smiling as memories flooded back. "He specialized in thoroughbreds, but his real passion was for Appaloosas," she began, her voice growing animated. "Said they had more sense than most people he knew. I learned to ride on a spotted gelding named Commander." For over an hour she shared stories of her childhood, the sun-drenched days spent in pastures and stables, the joy of breaking her first colt, the quiet evenings watching new foals with her father. Elijah listened intently, asking occasional questions that revealed his own deep knowledge of horses. It was only when she mentioned her mother's death and her father's subsequent decline that she faltered. "He sold the farm when I was 19, she said, her voice dropping. "Drank away most of the proceeds within a year. That's when the Whitneys took me in, old family friends offering charity to the daughter of their deceased neighbor." "And Silas saw an opportunity," Elijah supplied. Emma nodded. "By then I had nowhere else to go. When he proposed, everyone said how fortunate I was. The penniless orphan saved by the wealthy rancher's son. People see what they want to see," Elijah observed quietly. "Yes." Emma stared into the fire. "They certainly didn't see the bruises beneath my sleeves." Elijah's hand found hers in the firelight, his rough palm warm against her fingers. The contact was brief but steadying, an anchor in the storm of memory. "Try to get some sleep," he said, rising. "I'll take watch." As Emma settled into bed, she watched Elijah resume his post by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the moonlit snow outside. In the morning, Silas would come with his men and his rage and his wounded pride, but for the first time she would not face him alone. From the ridge above the cabin, barely visible against the night sky, a lone figure watched the light in the window, calculating, planning, waiting for dawn. Dawn arrived with the metallic taste of dread. Emma stood at the cabin window, watching the eastern sky lighten from indigo to pale gold, each passing minute bringing Silas closer. She had slept fitfully, waking often to find Elijah still vigilant, his silhouette unchanged against the starlit snow. Now he moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, checking windows, positioning weapons, his focus absolute. In the cold morning light, he looked harder somehow, the bounty hunter's instincts rising to the surface like a second skin he'd never fully shed. "They'll come from the ridge," he said, nodding toward the northern approach. "It's the only way to bring horses down in this snow." Emma nodded, her mouth dry. "How many do you think?" "6, maybe 8. Whitney won't risk coming alone, not after losing that bounty hunter." Elijah handed her a small revolver, its weight unfamiliar in her palm. "You know how to use this?" "My father taught me." She checked the cylinder with unpracticed hands. "Though I've never fired at a person. Hope you won't have to." His eyes met hers, serious and direct. "But if it comes to it, don't hesitate. These men won't show mercy because you're a woman." The brutal truth of his words settled over her. This wasn't like the stories she'd read as a girl, where villains had changes of heart and heroes emerged unscathed. Real violence was coming, and blood would be spilled before the day was through. "I understand." She tucked the revolver into the pocket of her borrowed coat. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay inside, stay low. If I fall..." His voice remained steady, but something flickered in his eyes. "There's a trap door under the rug by the hearth, root cellar beneath. Hide there until nightfall, then take my horse and ride east. You'll hit the territorial road by morning." The calm practicality with which he discussed his own death chilled her more than the winter air seeping through the cabin walls. Before she could respond, he stiffened, gaze shifting to the window. "They're here." Emma moved to look past his shoulder. In the distance, dark shapes appeared against the snow, riders moving steadily down the ridge, sunlight glinting off rifle barrels. She counted 7 men, Silas unmistakable at their lead on his distinctive white stallion. "That's him," she whispered unnecessarily. Elijah nodded once, then turned to face her. For a brief moment his stoic mask slipped, revealing something tender and fierce beneath. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, knowing you was worth it." The simple declaration stole her breath. Before she could find words to respond, he was moving to the door, rifle in hand, stepping onto the porch to meet whatever came. Emma positioned herself at the window, revolver ready, heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard across the valley. Outside, Elijah stood tall and unmoving as the riders approached, snow crunching beneath their horses' hooves in the brittle silence. Silas Whitney reined in 20 yards from the cabin, his men fanning out behind him in a practice formation. He looked exactly as Emma remembered, handsome in a cruel way, immaculately dressed despite the journey, every inch the wealthy rancher accustomed to deference. The sight of him sent ice through her veins, memories of pain and humiliation, threatening to overwhelm her hard-won courage. "That's far enough," Elijah called, his voice carrying across the snow. Silas studied him with cold appraisal. "You're the bounty hunter, Tanner." "Not anymore. Yet here you are, holding my property." Silas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm a reasonable man. Return what's mine and there doesn't need to be trouble." "She's not property," Elijah replied, his voice level, "and she's not yours." Silas's expression hardened. $500 for her safe return. That's more than fair. "Not interested." $1,000 then." Silas leaned forward in his saddle. "That's a fortune for a man like you. Buy yourself a real ranch instead of this wilderness outpost." Elijah remained unmoved. "Miss Caldwell isn't for sale." A murmur ran through Silas's men, and Emma saw hands drift toward weapons. Tension crackled in the frigid air like static before lightning. "She's my fiancée," Silas said, voice hardening. "She's confused, unwell. Ran off with family heirlooms worth more than this entire mountain." "That's a lie," Emma called, unable to remain silent any longer. She stepped onto the porch beside Elijah, ignoring his sharp glance. "I took nothing but the clothes I wore." Silas's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, the borrowed men's clothing, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face no longer bearing the marks of his last beating. Something ugly twisted his features. "Look at you," he sneered, "dressed like a common tramp, living with this scarred degenerate. What would your father say if he could see you now?" "He'd say I finally found a real man," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Not a coward who beats women." The words struck home. Silas's face flushed dark with rage, and he swung down from his horse in a single fluid motion. "I've had enough of this farce," he snarled. "Emma, get your things, we're leaving. She's not going anywhere with you." Elijah's rifle came up slightly, not quite aimed, but a clear warning. Silas ignored him, taking a step forward. "Emma, now." "No." The single word felt like freedom on her tongue. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the winter air. Then Silas smiled, a cold, calculating expression that Emma recognized with dread. "Johnson," he called without turning. "Show Mr. Tanner what happens to men who take what's mine." One of the riders, a heavy-set man with a pockmarked face, raised his rifle. The shot cracked across the valley before Emma could even cry out in warning. Elijah moved with stunning speed, shoving her back through the cabin door as the bullet splintered wood where he'd been standing. In the same motion, he brought his own rifle up and fired. The pockmarked man jerked in his saddle, then toppled sideways into the snow. Chaos erupted. Silas's men scattered for cover, rifles barking. Elijah fired twice more in quick succession, then followed Emma into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. "Get down," he ordered, positioning himself at a window. Emma crouched behind the heavy oak table he'd overturned the night before as preparation. Outside, men shouted orders, horses whinnied in panic, and bullets thudded into the cabin's reinforced walls. "5 left," Elijah reported tersely, firing through a narrow gap in the shutters. A cry from outside suggested he'd found his mark. 4. "Silas?" Emma asked, loading the revolver with shaking hands. Taking cover behind the woodpile, Elijah ducked as a bullet shattered the oiled paper of the window. He won't risk himself until his men have done the dying. A new sound joined the cacophony, the rhythmic thud of an axe against the cabin's rear wall. They were trying to break through while the gunfire kept Elijah occupied at the front. "The back," Emma warned. Elijah nodded grimly. "Can you hold the front?" She swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes." He squeezed her shoulder once, then moved swiftly to the rear of the cabin. Emma took his place at the window, trying to steady her breathing as she peered out at the snow-covered yard, where 4 men, no, 3 now, sought to kill the man who had saved her life. A flash of movement caught her eye. Silas darting from the woodpile toward the barn. He was trying to circle around to catch them in crossfire. Without hesitation, Emma aimed and pulled the trigger. The revolver bucked in her hand, the shot going wide but forcing Silas back to cover. Behind her, she heard Elijah fire twice in rapid succession, followed by a gurgling cry that told her at least one of the men trying to break through the rear wall wouldn't trouble them again. "Emma," Silas's voice called from outside. "You've had your adventure. It's time to come home. I'll forgive everything if you come out now." The familiar coaxing tone, the voice he'd used after previous beatings when the violence was done and the manipulation began, sent a surge of rage through her veins. "There's nothing to forgive, Silas," she shouted back. "I'm exactly where I want to be." His answering laugh was cold as the snow outside. "With a dead man? Tanner's bleeding out as we speak. My men caught him in the first volley." Emma froze, turning to look at Elijah. He stood at the rear window, his left side dark with blood that he'd been hiding from her. As their eyes met, he swayed slightly, catching himself against the wall. "Elijah," she breathed, horror washing through her. "It's not bad," he lied, his face pale beneath his tan. "Keep watching the front." But it was bad. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the growing stain spreading down his side. And outside, Silas was regrouping, preparing for the final push that would overwhelm them both. "Let me see," Emma demanded, abandoning her post to move toward Elijah. "Stay where you are," he ordered, his voice sharp with pain. "They'll rush us if they think we're distracted." As if to confirm his words, a volley of shots peppered the front of the cabin. Emma reluctantly returned to the window, stealing glances at Elijah as he pressed a hand to his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "How many left?" she asked, forcing herself to focus. 3, maybe 4. Elijah's breathing was labored but controlled. 2 at the front, at least 1 at the back. Silas is directing them. Emma peered cautiously through the window. The morning sun reflected blindingly off the snow, making it difficult to spot Silas's men. A flash of movement caught her eye, someone darting between trees at the edge of the clearing. "I see one," she whispered, raising her revolver. "Wait for a clear shot," Elijah coached, his voice steadier than his pale face warranted. "Don't waste bullets." The man moved again, more carelessly this time. Emma tracked him, remembering her father's lessons from long ago. "Breathe steady. Squeeze. Don't pull." The revolver cracked in her hand, and the man stumbled, clutching his leg before dragging himself behind a tree. "Good," Elijah said simply, the single word warming her despite their desperate situation. Outside, Silas's voice carried across the snow. "Getting a woman to do your fighting, Tanner? How pathetic." Elijah ignored the taunt, moving painfully to check the rear window. As he did, his knees buckled momentarily, one hand catching the wall for support. Emma was at his side instantly, wrapping an arm around his waist. "You need to sit down," she insisted, feeling the warm wetness of his blood soaking through her sleeve. "Can't," he gritted out. "Not yet." But he leaned against her briefly, his considerable weight nearly buckling her knees. Need to end this before they realize how bad it is. Emma helped him to the rear window, horrified at the trail of blood droplets they left across the floor. The bullet had caught him just below the ribs on his left side, a spot that could mean anything from a painful flesh wound to a mortal injury. "What's your plan?" she asked, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. Elijah's dark eyes met hers, pain and determination warring in their depths. "Draw them in closer, make them overconfident." His gaze shifted to the rifle in his hands. 5 shots left, need to make them count. Emma understood with sudden clarity. "You want them to think you're more wounded than you are. To rush the cabin." "Yes." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Except I am this wounded, so it'll have to be you who surprises them." The trust implicit in his words, that she could stand against trained killers, that she had the courage and skill to save them both, struck Emma deeply. Silas had never believed her capable of anything beyond decorating his home and warming his bed. But this man, this scarred, silent protector who barely knew her, was placing his life in her hands without hesitation. "Tell me what to do," she said. Elijah outlined his plan in terse, economical phrases. Emma would maintain position at the front window, making it appear they were both there. Meanwhile, Elijah would move to the trapdoor leading to the root cellar, emerge outside through its external entrance, and flank Silas's men from behind. "It's too dangerous," Emma protested. "You can barely stand." "No choice." His expression softened slightly. "Trust me, Emma. I've survived worse." Looking at the growing blood stain on his shirt, Emma wasn't convinced, but she nodded reluctantly. Before he could move toward the trapdoor, she caught his arm. "Wait." She tore a strip from her petticoat and quickly bound it around his midsection, pulling it tight to slow the bleeding. Her fingers worked deftly, ignoring the warm slickness of his blood. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Thank you," he said softly. Emma impulsively pressed her hand to his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm. "Come back to me." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, tenderness, resolve. He covered her hand with his own for the briefest moment, then pulled away, moving toward the trap door with renewed purpose. Emma returned to the front window, making enough noise for Silas's men to believe both defenders remained active. Outside, the morning had progressed, the sun now high enough to cast short shadows across the snow. No movement was visible, but she knew they were there, waiting, planning. "I know you can hear me, Emma," Silas called, his voice carrying clearly in the winter air. "This doesn't need to end with bloodshed. Come out now, and I'll let Tanner live." "Like you let Martha and James live?" she called back, her voice steady. "I remember the farm burning, Silas. I remember them screaming." A moment of silence followed her accusation, then Silas's voice, colder now. "That was unfortunate, but necessary, just as this is." Emma heard a low whistle, a signal between Silas and his men. Moments later, a barrage of gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the cabin from multiple directions. She ducked instinctively, then forced herself to peer through a gap in the shutters. 3 men were advancing from different directions, using the covering fire to approach the cabin. Behind her, Elijah had disappeared through the trapdoor. She was alone. Emma took a deep breath, then fired at the nearest attacker. He dove for cover, but her shot had served its purpose, slowing his advance. She moved to another window, firing again, creating the illusion of multiple defenders. The seconds stretched into minutes, a deadly game of advance and retreat as Silas's men crept closer to the cabin. Emma conserved her ammunition, firing only when necessary, her eyes constantly searching for Elijah in the trees behind their attackers. A crash from the rear of the cabin told her at least one man had reached the back wall. She spun, racing to the position Elijah had abandoned, arriving just as an axe splintered through the reinforced wood. Through the jagged opening, she saw a bearded face, eyes widening in surprise at finding her instead of a wounded man. Emma fired without hesitation, the shot deafening in the confined space. The man dropped from view with a strangled cry. Outside, someone shouted in alarm, "They're trapped in there!" Silas's voice, triumphant now. "Finish it!" The front door suddenly shuddered under a heavy impact, someone trying to break it down. Emma rushed back, her heart pounding, knowing she couldn't defend both entrances at once. The door held against the first assault, but another blow splintered the upper hinges. Where was Elijah? Had he collapsed in the snow, bleeding out while she fought alone? One more blow would breach the door. Emma positioned herself behind the overturned table, revolver aimed, ready to sell her life dearly. She wouldn't go back to Silas. She wouldn't live under his hand again. Better to die here, fighting, than return to that slow death of spirit and dignity. The door burst inward with a crack of breaking wood. A man rushed through, gun raised, and jerked backward as a shot rang out from somewhere behind him. He fell face first onto the cabin floor, revealing Elijah standing in the doorway, rifle smoking in his hands. His face was ghostly pale, blood soaking the makeshift bandage at his side, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. Behind him, the snow was stained crimson where he dragged himself into position. "Silas?" Emma asked, rushing to his side as he staggered into the cabin. "Still out there?" Elijah leaned heavily against her, his strength clearly fading. One man left with him, taking cover by the woodpile. Emma helped him to a chair, noting with horror how much blood he'd lost. His skin was clammy to the touch, his breathing increasingly labored. Without immediate help, he wouldn't survive the day. "Emma?" Silas's voice again, closer now. "It's over. Tanner's as good as dead. Come out now and I'll make sure you're comfortable back home. Fight, and you'll join him in a shallow grave." She looked at Elijah, seeing in his eyes that he knew the truth of his condition. "Go," he whispered. "While you still can, take the back way. The horses are still in the lean-to." "I'm not leaving you," Emma said fiercely. "Don't throw your life away," he urged, his voice weakening. "Not for me." "It's my life to throw," she replied, checking her revolver's cylinder. 2 bullets left. "And I choose how it ends." Outside, snow crunched as someone approached the cabin. Emma moved to the window, peering out cautiously. Silas stood in the open, 30 feet from the porch, his remaining man positioned to one side with a rifle trained on the door. "Final chance, Emma," Silas called. "I'm counting to 10. Emma turned back to Elijah, who was struggling to rise despite his injury. Their eyes met in silent communication, understanding, regret, and something deeper that neither had dared name. "Stay behind me," he whispered, forcing himself to his feet through sheer willpower. "No," Emma said, gently but firmly pushing him back into the chair. "You've protected me long enough." Before he could stop her, she moved to the door, revolver concealed in the folds of her skirt. Time seemed to slow as she stepped onto the porch, facing the man who had terrorized her, who had pursued her across the territory, who had nearly destroyed the one person who had shown her true kindness. Silas smiled, triumph gleaming in his cold eyes as he saw her emerge alone. "I knew you'd be sensible in the end," he said, starting toward her with outstretched hand. "Come, let's put this unpleasantness behind us." Behind him, his last gunman kept his rifle trained on the cabin door, ready for any movement from within. Neither man noticed Emma's hand tightening around the revolver hidden in her skirt. "Is he dead?" Silas asked, nodding toward the cabin. "Tanner?" Emma lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. You want to know if he's dead? Come closer and find out. Silas's smile faltered as he studied Emma's face. Something in her expression, a calmness, a resolve that hadn't been there before, made him hesitate mid-step. "What game are you playing?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "No game, Silas." Emma's fingers tightened around the revolver, still hidden in her skirt. "Just ending things, one way or another." His eyes narrowed, arrogance momentarily replaced by uncertainty. He glanced at his remaining gunman, then back to Emma. "You've changed." "Yes." "It doesn't matter." Confidence returned to his voice. "You're still coming home with me, where you belong." Emma shook her head slowly. "I'm already home." Confusion flickered across his face, followed quickly by anger. With him, that scarred nobody, a man who can't even protect himself, let alone you. "He protected me from you," Emma said quietly. "That's more than anyone else ever did." Silas's face darkened. "Enough of this nonsense. Harper, keep your gun on the door. I'm taking her now." He started forward again, hand outstretched to grab her arm. Emma stepped back, bringing the revolver into view. "Don't touch me. Not ever again." Silas froze, his eyes fixed on the weapon. For a heartbeat, the tableau held. Emma on the porch, revolver steady in her hand. Silas before her, face contorted with disbelief. Harper pivoting his rifle toward this new threat. "You wouldn't dare," Silas hissed. Emma met his gaze unflinchingly. "You never did understand me, did you? All those months together and you never saw me, not really." A flicker of movement caught her peripheral vision. Harper taking aim. Emma pivoted and fired in one fluid motion. The shot cracked across the clearing, catching the gunman in the shoulder. He stumbled backward, rifle discharging harmlessly into the air before he fell. Emma turned back to Silas just as he lunged for her. She fired her last bullet, but panic made her hand jerk. The shot went wide, and then he was on her, his weight bearing her down onto the porch boards. The revolver clattered from her grasp as his hands closed around her throat. "You ungrateful bitch," he snarled, fingers tightening. "After everything I gave you." Black spots danced at the edges of Emma's vision as she clawed at his hands, her lungs burning for air. This was how it would end, not with escape or freedom, but with Silas's face the last thing she would ever see. The irony was bitter as bile in her throat. A shadow fell across them. Silas looked up, his grip loosening slightly in surprise. Elijah stood in the doorway, blood-soaked and swaying, but upright. In his hand was not a gun, but a long hunting knife. "Let her go," he said, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Silas laughed, genuinely amused despite the situation. "Or what? You can barely stand." "I don't need to stand to kill you." Elijah's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Just need to fall in the right direction." Something in his tone made Silas hesitate. He looked into Elijah's eyes and saw death looking back. Not anger or fear or desperation, but the cold professional assessment of a man who had made violence his trade. It was all the distraction Emma needed. She drove her knee upward with every ounce of strength she possessed, connecting solidly with Silas's groin. He howled, his grip breaking as he instinctively curled inward. Emma rolled sideways, gasping for breath as blood returned to her head in a painful rush. Silas recovered quickly, fury overtaking pain as he scrambled to his feet. But Elijah was there, moving with the last reserves of his strength, knife extended. They collided in a tangle of limbs, Silas's momentum carrying them both off the porch and into the snow. Emma struggled to her knees, vision clearing in time to see the two men grappling in a crimson-stained patch of white. Despite his wound, Elijah fought with the calculated precision of experience, his movements economic where Silas's were wild with rage. The knife flashed once, twice in the winter sun. Silas staggered backward, hand pressed to his side, disbelief written across his features. You cut me." Elijah rose unsteadily to his feet, positioning himself between Emma and her former fiancé. Blood dripped from the knife in his hand, indistinguishable from his own that soaked his shirt. "Go," he said simply, "while you still can." For a moment Emma thought Silas might attack again. His eyes darted between them, rage warring with self-preservation. Then he looked past them to where Harper lay moaning in the snow, to the bodies of his other men scattered across the clearing. "This isn't over," he spat, backing toward his horse. "I'll be back with more men. You'll both pay for this." "No." Elijah's voice stopped him. "You won't be back. Because if you ever come near her again, if you ever so much as speak her name, I will find you. And when I do, there won't be enough left of you to bury." The cold certainty in his tone made even Emma shiver. Silas stared at Elijah for a long moment, then at Emma, his expression unreadable. Without another word, he turned and stumbled toward his horse, clutching his wounded side. Emma watched as he mounted awkwardly and rode away, Harper following on his own horse, hunched over in pain. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did she turn to Elijah. He stood motionless, knife still in hand, eyes fixed on the spot where Silas had vanished. Then, as if a puppet's strings had been cut, he collapsed to his knees in the blood-stained snow. "Elijah!" Emma was at his side instantly, catching him before he could fall face first. His weight nearly took her down, but she braced herself, cradling his head against her shoulder. "Hold on. Please hold on." His eyes found hers, clouded with pain but still aware. "Did he hurt you?" "No," she lied, ignoring the bruises forming on her throat. "I'm fine. But you're not. We need to get you inside." Somehow, through desperation, determination, or some miracle, she managed to help him back into the cabin. Blood soaked his left side, the makeshift bandage she'd applied earlier now saturated and useless. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow. Emma eased him onto the bed, then worked quickly to remove his shirt and assess the damage. The bullet had entered just below his ribs and remained lodged inside, a fact that had likely saved him from bleeding out immediately. But infection was setting in, the wound hot and angry around the edges. "Need to get the bullet out," Elijah managed, each word clearly costing him. "I don't know how," Emma admitted, fear making her voice shake. "I'll talk you through it." His hand found hers, surprisingly strong despite his weakness. "But first, water. And whiskey." Emma moved with frantic efficiency, gathering what she needed: water from the barrel by the door, the bottle of whiskey Elijah had packed, clean cloths, his hunting knife. Her hands trembled as she helped him drink, first water, then a long pull of whiskey. "Now you," he said, eyes fixed on her face. "You'll need it." She took a swallow, the liquor burning a path down her throat. It steadied her somewhat, dulling the edges of her terror. Under Elijah's increasingly slurred direction, Emma prepared to remove the bullet. She cleansed the knife in whiskey, positioned cloths to catch the blood, and placed a leather belt between his teeth. "Deep breath," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "This will hurt." His eyes held hers, trust evident despite the pain clouding them. "Do it." Emma steeled herself and began. The next hour passed in a nightmare of blood and pain, Elijah's strangled groans and her own desperate prayers mingling in the close air of the cabin. Twice she thought she'd lost him as he slipped into unconsciousness, but each time he rallied, his indomitable will forcing him back from the brink. When she finally extracted the misshapen piece of lead, her hands were slick with his blood, her face streaked with tears. She dropped the bullet into a tin cup with a dull clink that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Cauterize it, Elijah whispered, barely conscious. Fire. Iron. Emma understood. She heated his knife in the flames until it glowed red, then pressed it against the wound, gagging at the smell of burning flesh. Elijah's body arched once in agony, then went limp. For one terrible moment, Emma thought he was gone. Then she saw the slight rise and fall of his chest, shallow, uneven, but there. Night had fallen by the time she finished cleaning and bandaging him. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and Elijah's labored breathing. Emma sat beside him, her hand in his, watching his face for any sign of change. "Don't leave me," she whispered into the darkness. "Please. Not when I've just found you." Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the blood-stained battlefield in a clean white shroud. The horses in the lean-to nickered softly, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the ache in Emma's heart. Dawn would tell whether Elijah Tanner lived or died. Until then, Emma would keep her vigil, clinging to hope with the same fierce determination that had brought her through all the rest. Emma didn't remember falling asleep, but she woke with a start, neck stiff from hours spent in the wooden chair beside Elijah's bed. Gray dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the floor. For one terrible moment, she feared the stillness beneath her hand meant Elijah had slipped away during the night. Then his chest rose slightly, the movement barely perceptible but undeniably there. He lived, if only barely. Emma touched his forehead, alarmed by the heat radiating from his skin. Fever had set in despite her efforts to clean the wound. Without a doctor, without proper medicine, infection would claim him as surely as Silas's bullet would have. "No," she whispered fiercely. "I won't lose you. Not now." She worked throughout the morning, bathing his fevered body with cool water from the creek, forcing small sips of broth between his cracked lips when consciousness briefly returned. His moments of lucidity were rare and disjointed. Sometimes he called for Isabel, his dead wife's name a prayer on his lips. Other times he seemed to know Emma, his fingers weakly squeezing hers when she held his hand. By midday, Emma knew she needed help. The cabin's supplies were dwindling, and Elijah required medicine she didn't have. The nearest town was 2 days' ride in good weather, but she had no choice. She would have to leave him and seek help. "I'm going to get a doctor," she told him during a rare moment of clarity. "I'll ride to Silver Creek. You just hold on until I get back." Elijah's eyes, bright with fever, found hers. "Too dangerous," he rasped. "Whitney." "Silas is wounded and miles away by now," Emma assured him, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll be careful, I promise." His hand caught her wrist with surprising strength. "If I don't make it, don't," Emma interrupted, tears threatening. "Don't you dare say goodbye to me, Elijah Tanner." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn woman." "You're the one who's stubborn," she countered, blinking back tears. "Too stubborn to die from a little bullet wound." The smile faded, and his expression grew serious. "Emma, listen. North wall, behind the loose stone. Take it, if I'm gone when you return." Before she could question him, his eyes slid closed again, consciousness fleeing as fever reclaimed him. Emma sat for a moment, torn between curiosity about his mysterious instruction and the urgent need to prepare for her journey. Necessity won. She gathered supplies quickly: food, water, the remaining ammunition, Elijah's spare coat. Before leaving, she built up the fire and left water and broth within his reach, though she doubted he would be able to help himself. At the door, Emma paused for one last look. Elijah lay still and pale against the rough blankets, his breathing shallow but steady. The scar on his face seemed more pronounced against his ashen skin, a reminder of all he had survived before. Perhaps he would survive this too. "I'll be back," she promised. "Wait for me." The journey to Silver Creek was grueling. Emma pushed herself and Elijah's sturdy black stallion to their limits, stopping only when absolutely necessary. She rode through the night guided by starlight and desperation, ignoring the pain in her own healing ribs and the exhaustion that threatened to unseat her. By dawn of the second day, Silver Creek appeared on the horizon, a small frontier town with a church steeple and scattered buildings. Emma rode directly to the doctor's house, nearly falling from the saddle as she dismounted. Dr. Wilson, a grizzled man in his 60s, took one look at her bruised face and exhausted state and ushered her inside without question. Only when she had explained Elijah's condition did his expression grow grave. 2 days with an untreated gunshot wound and fever? He shook his head. "I won't lie to you, miss. The chances aren't good." "Will you come?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. "Please." Something in her desperation must have moved him. "I'll come. But we leave immediately." They rode hard, the doctor following Emma back into the mountains with his medical bag and a pack mule laden with supplies. When they finally reached the cabin late on the third day, Emma's heart was in her throat as she pushed open the door. Elijah lay exactly as she had left him, still and silent on the bed. For one terrible moment, she thought they were too late. Then his chest rose slightly, proof of life against all odds. "He's alive," she breathed. "For now," Dr. Wilson said grimly, already rolling up his sleeves. "Let's keep him that way." The next hours passed in a blur as the doctor worked to save Elijah's life. He reopened the wound, cleaning out infection that had festered in Emma's absence, then stitched it properly with catgut sutures. Medicines were administered, laudanum for pain, willow bark for fever, herbs to fight infection. "He's strong," the doctor observed as they finally stepped back from the bed. "Most men would have died the first day with a wound like that." "Will he recover?" Emma asked, afraid to hope. "If the fever breaks by morning, he has a chance." The doctor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You should rest. You're dead on your feet." But Emma wouldn't leave Elijah's side, not when each breath might be his last. She maintained her vigil through the night, applying cool compresses to his forehead, murmuring encouragement when he stirred restlessly. The doctor dozed in a chair by the fire, waking occasionally to check on his patient. Near dawn, Elijah's fever broke. Emma felt the change before she saw it, his skin cooling beneath her fingers, his breathing deepening into a more natural rhythm. When his eyes finally opened, clear and aware for the first time in days, she couldn't hold back her tears. "You came back," he said, his voice weak but steady. "Of course I did." Emma took his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "I told you I would." A week passed before Dr. Wilson deemed Elijah stable enough to be left in Emma's care. The bullet had done significant damage, and full recovery would take months, but the worst danger had passed. Before leaving, the doctor pulled Emma aside. "Sheriff in Silver Creek was asking about you," he said quietly. "Seems your former fiancé filed charges, theft, assault, claims you stole family heirlooms." Fear gripped Emma's heart. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet." The doctor's eyes were kind. "But you should know, Whitney's reputation precedes him. Not everyone believes his story." After the doctor departed, Emma remembered Elijah's feverish instructions: north wall, behind the loose stone. It took some searching, but she finally found it, a stone that moved slightly when pressed. Behind it was a small leather pouch. Inside she found papers, deeds to the ranch and line cabin, both transferred to her name. And something else, a small velvet bag containing a simple gold ring and a note in Elijah's careful handwriting. "Isabel would have wanted you to have this. Whether I live or die, the ranch is yours. But I hope if I survive, you might consider sharing it with me. Not from necessity or gratitude, but from choice." Emma clutched the note to her chest, tears blurring her vision. She returned to Elijah's bedside, finding him awake and watching her. "You found it," he said simply. "Why?" she asked. "Why give me everything you've built?" "Because you gave me back something I thought was lost forever." His scarred face was solemn, vulnerable. Hope. Emma gently sat beside him on the bed, the ring warm in her palm. "And this?" A question. His eyes held hers, one I'm not sure I deserve to ask. "Ask anyway," she whispered. "When I'm healed," he said. "When you're truly free and this is all behind us. Would you consider staying? Not as someone I protected or saved, but as my equal, my partner." Emma looked down at the simple gold band, then back to the scarred face of the man who had changed everything. She thought of the creek where he had found her, of his vow that no man would ever hurt her again. She thought of Silas and the life she had escaped, of the freedom she now possessed thanks to this quiet, honorable man. "I don't need to consider it," she said finally. "I already know my answer." She slipped the ring onto her finger, then carefully leaned down to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, mindful of his injuries, but filled with promise. "Is that a yes?" Elijah asked when they parted, a smile touching his lips. "That's a yes," Emma confirmed. "But not because you saved me." "Why then?" "Because you saw me," she said simply. "Even at my most broken. You saw me, not as something to possess or control, but as someone worth fighting for." Outside, the winter sun rose over the mountains, casting golden light through the cabin windows. Spring would come eventually, melting the snow, bringing new life to the valley. By then, Elijah would be healed enough to ride back to the main ranch. By then, word would have spread about Silas Whitney's disgrace, how he'd been bested by a woman he'd abused and a wounded rancher, how his false charges had been dismissed when the truth came to light. But all that lay in the future. For now, there was only this moment, a cabin in the wilderness, a healing man, a woman who had found her strength and the promise of tomorrow's sunrise.